nobody has agreed on when modernism began. First off, there's disagreement starting from the French Revolution. Some people go back that far and believe that the modern era, which is essentially a political position. Some people believe it would be mid-19th century with the Second French Revolution in 1848 and the recognition of the people, and so we have realist painters in France painting images of people with dirty feet, everyday folks that never would have been found in a work of visual art before the 19th century. And some people believe, I'm coming to believe, I'll put my position out here, I'm coming to believe that it really begins with Cézanne and Picasso, talking about visual art, Cézanne and Picasso at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, where the formal revolutions really take hold. The subject matter throughout the 19th century is modern, but the formal ways of depicting those subjects doesn't really happen until the very end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Most of the development in the 20th century, in the modern period, is formal. I mean, there's the wars have a huge impact. World War I and World War II have a huge impact on modernism in Europe. And World War II, in fact, Hitler essentially drove the modern artists out of Europe and Western Europe and to New York, where they bring their ideas. And, then we have the first international movement of significance in this country after World War II, because the Europeans bring all their really fun and crazy ideas to the U.S., where they meet the young, kind of innocent American artists and turn them on to modernism and so forth. But most of outside of the movement that the wars caused in Western Europe, most of the developments really have to do with formal developments, the use of line and color and shape and the illusion of space and so forth. So you can find a politically motivated anti-World War I movement in Dada, but that doesn't really shape the significant contributions that Dada made. I mean, it shapes the overall movement of rebellion and revolution, the anti-art movement that is essentially anti-war, since they equated the war with the tradition of art, or equated the tradition of art with the violence and death caused by the war. But I don't know that I can really, until the end of the 20th century, I can really say that modern art has caused any great cultural or social revolutions. The Dadaists were based all over Western Europe, but primarily in Zurich, and they founded their group. I mean, they selected the name Dada themselves, right? So they named themselves. They founded their group as a protest movement against World War I. They were in Zurich, and Zurich was neutral. Switzerland was neutral during World War I, just like it was later. It is later, I guess. And so they gathered there during World War I and developed a theory based on the idea that men had always been rational creatures. And in always being rational creatures, men had always started wars. And so they came up with this idea that war could be eliminated if you would just stop being rational. If you just stop being reasonable, then you could eliminate war. And I mean, it was an ideal, it wasn't true. They knew it wasn't true, but it was an idealistic kind of theory that propelled Dada. So Dada is unreasonable. It doesn't make sense. They do sound poetry or noise music, and they make crazy, assemblages that don't make any sense. And all of that is a protest against rational thought, that Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thought. So they're kind of rejecting that, and by rejecting that in their artworks or their plays or their musical performances and so forth, they think they're rejecting the Western rational tradition. And in a way that I just sort of articulated, that it didn't really have an effect on the war. It didn't bring the war to a close at all, but it certainly opened a lot of avenues for later artists to experiment with. So that's a politically motivated but politically ineffectual form of art making. And the second moment I was talking about was World War II. And that's different in the sense that it has a fascist leader and fascist armies and so forth that parade across Europe, east to west, taking towns. Poland, I guess, is the first to go, and taking countries, I mean, one by one, and they get close to France, which the Nazis took in 1940, and are occupied in 1940, and as they're nearing, so many French intellectuals and poets and German filmmakers too, or there are tons of really important German filmmakers in the 20s, and in the early 30s, and they all head farther west. So they escape Hitler, not all of them, but some escaped Hitler and came to this country. Then they're bringing their idea. I mean, the Germans all went to Hollywood, which you probably know, to make films, and the visual artists stayed in New York, and they bring their ideas of modernism to this country, and we can't say it's totally a European invasion that causes what's called late modernism, post-war modernism, but they certainly had a lot to do with it in their influence on young American artists. The early 70s were focused on conceptual art, and we're talking visual art, not music or theater or anything, but conceptual art, which had developed as a reaction to minimal art in the 1960s. Minimal artists like Donald Judd and Robert Morris focused the viewer's attention on the object, on the thing, right? And one had a phenomenological experience with the art object in space, standing in the same space where the object is standing and so forth. So it was very much about space and materials and objecthood, a singular focused object. And then in reaction to that, I mean, this is simplifying it, obviously, but in reaction to that, conceptual art begins to happen towards the end of the 1960s, which is a rejection of the object altogether, and a reassertion of what some conceptual artists and theorists believe is a more traditional form of art about ideas. And so objects aren't necessary. I mean, there are things that transmit ideas that are necessary, like photographs and written texts and that sort of thing. But the focus is away from the object and onto the concept of the work and the in purely kind of idealistic terms, the communication of the idea is the content of the art. It's not about how things look, but what they say. I mean, you never know what's happening at the very moment that you're making something or you're looking at something that's being made at the very moment. But in retrospect, what we saw is a conceptual art, because it doesn't involve objects, sculptures and paintings, is essentially the end of the line for modernism. There's nowhere to go. It's gotten rid of everything that art painting traditionally had, like representation or narrative or color or the illusion of space. All of those things are gone. And conceptual art says, no, it's not about the form, it's not about the looks, it's about the ideas. You don't need anything. That was even a conceptual artist named Robert Barry who made telepathic art that didn't have any existence. He believed that he could communicate telepathically. I mean, he wasn't crazy at all. It's a conceptual idea. Communicate telepathically with the viewer, that he didn't need any form at all, any material at all. So that, in a way, that's a very generalized chronology of modernism, but it runs out of gas in the 1970s. There's nowhere to go. So once the mainstream comes to an end, this progressive development, once that comes to an end, nothing comes crashing down, but as it slowly appears to young artists that now there's nowhere to go. We've reduced art to this invisible idea. Where do we go now? That artists say, well, there's nowhere, we don't have to go anywhere. Let's just do our thing, do what we want. And so all the artists start making paintings and they make sculptures, but they also make photographs. It's the first time photography is accepted as art is in the 70s. And that era is now we refer to as pluralist era. So it's kind of do your own thing. right? Because there's no mainstream propelled by Picasso and Pollock and Frank Stella, and Donald Judd that, push this mainstream development. That's all irrelevant for young artists. And so you do whatever you want. A lot of videos produced because the technology is there by the late 60s or 65 when the Portapack becomes available, if not affordable, but available. So lots of people are making videos, they're making performances, they're just doing all kinds of things in the late 70s. And at the time, it was almost impossible to figure out what was going on, because we'd always known that art, or I'd always known as a fledgling art historian, that art developed in a progressive kind of way, right? The Renaissance period is a progression from the medieval period, and the Baroque period is a progression from the Renaissance period, and so forth. That period followed period followed period, and that continues throughout most of the 20th century, and then it doesn't. The artists that developed in the late 70s and early 80s associated with the very early years of postmodernism just didn't feel that the paintings by modern artists made sense in the world as they were living it in the mid to late 20th century. That just did not reflect their world, and so they embrace nonsense. Sort of like, I think once you asked me about that, about Dada, sort of like Dada, they embrace this sort of nonsensical language in their work, as that they believe that it reflects the world more accurately than the false utopian ideals of the modernists. A lot of postmodernists were thinking in the late 70s about imagery as free-floating, a non-hierarchical view of imagery that didn't place the Mona Lisa above an advertisement for Coca-Cola. A billboard was just as good as a painting in a museum. And that equivalization of imagery means that artists can grab from here and there and here and there. And the artists that we most associate with that period, like David Sally or Cindy Sherman, believe that they can take any image they want and create whatever kind of narrative or non-narrative that they want. There's all the bounds of restrictions of the modern period. They don't look like restrictions when you're in it, but once you're younger, you get out of it, you realize that I don't have to do things this way, and I can take a cigarette advertisement, I can take a painting by Raphael, and I can combine it in the same work of art. So that equivalent, non-hierarchical sense of imagery, I think, is really important, and that again reflects what we see in everyday life as we drive down the highway or move through the cities. That we see the collision of images